The America First Legal Foundation, combating the left's radical agenda.
Fight for the American people, defend the Constitution, and save this nation for the next generation. Welcome to this week's episode of The Arena with America First Legal. I'm Gene Hamilton. I'm joined today by my colleagues Ian, Dan, and Alexa. And we are here to have some fun, do things a little bit differently this week than we might normally. And this is going to be an episode that focuses, like another one that we've done in the recent past, on issues that are important to us, and issues that are important that we're seeing as an organization, and get into some topics that you might have seen in the news. So on this week's episode, we'd like to give a little bit more commentary and a little bit more explanation about something that you probably saw a number of years ago come out of the Biden Department of Justice, and something that has resuscitated itself, that our very own Ian Pryor got to participate recently in a roundtable at the Department of Justice, which relates to the weaponization of DOJ against parents who dare to speak out at school board meetings. Now, America First Legal was one of the first, actually the first organization to call out exactly what was going down in the fall of 2021. I vividly remember all of it. We showed how it was a big sham and how the entire thing was being politically orchestrated out of the White House for political purposes to advance a political agenda. It was not based in reality. We laid this all out there. It got seized upon, people ran with it, and lo and behold, over the course of the years since then, we've gotten and obtained a lot of documents that have proven exactly what we said was happening at the time. Exactly. I mean, the precise narrative that we said was occurring was in fact occurring. And all of this was a complete and total sham that was not supported by evidence, was not supported by facts, was not supported by on-the-ground reporting. And also, within the Department of Justice, from different components, you had active resistance to it being issued. And this, of course, is this Garland Memo. You all have probably seen it. You remember it. The effect of which was just to try to chill speech. So, Ian, how was your conversation at DOJ, and what do you think? Where do you think things go from here?
Yeah, well, it was a great roundtable at the Department of Justice. I mean, you had Acting Attorney General Blanche, you had Associate Attorney General Woodward, Kash Patel, Chairman Jim Jordan, Education Secretary Linda McMahon, former Governor Youngkin was there. Then you had some parents that were, sort of talking about their experiences. And, everybody brought a different perspective to the table. You had Scott Smith, whose daughter was sexually assaulted in a bathroom in Loudoun County, which of course became national news when that kid went and sexually assaulted somebody else. So, he was passionate in what he talked about. And I think, really, and I brought up the fact that it wasn't just a direction to U.S. attorneys and the FBI to investigate parents speaking at school board meetings, but there's also a green light to the activist class in these communities that really do the dirty work for their local school boards to say, look, these are the bad guys. These are basically domestic terrorists. So, have at it. Right. And that happens. And you see it happening across the country. So, I think that they're gonna start digging in. They're gonna get something out that really shows what their investigation, their internal investigation discovered, and it'll hopefully complement what we've done. Because I remember back in, and we've talked about this before, for people that don't know, Attorney General memo, right? The name of the Attorney General and a memo. This is sort of in DOJ. It's like a big deal, right? You have a memo that comes from the Attorney General, and it usually becomes sort of synonymous with that Attorney General, and it's a priority of the Justice Department. It's here's how we're going to prosecute, say, financial crimes, or here's how we're going to prosecute this. So Garland's memo, I mean, that's the worst thing to have associated with his name. But it takes a while to get this thing going, right? I mean, it doesn't take 4 days to do a memo. And that's basically what they were trying to claim at the time. It's like, well, the NSBA sent this letter and we looked into it, and then we just put this Attorney General memo together in 4 days and sent it out to everybody. And that was in the works from before because the NSBA sent the letter to the White House. The White House was coordinating with Justice. Justice was coordinating with the NSBA before they released it. I mean, there's emails that we've released that showed that. And as Chairman Jordan said last week, look, the reason for this memo was clear, and he pointed to Glenn Youngkin. It was so that you didn't get elected because of all the stuff was going on in Virginia, and it followed so closely after Terry McAuliffe's debate moment that this was a panic move to try and save the election in Virginia. And I mean, not only did it completely backfire, but it's continuing to backfire on everybody that was involved in that travesty.
Yeah. And I think one of the craziest things we've seen in the recent documents we uncovered was how much pushback they were getting internally. I mean, they were ready to go on this memo. It was the day of the memo's release, and there were senior officials at the Department of Justice and at the FBI who were saying, we've got big concerns. Hopefully we can talk about this because we're not on the same page.
It wasn't even careers. Some of the political appointees raised problems, and yet, they were kind of overruled.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's just such a farce. The whole notion that there was some political issue, there was some kind of, not political issue, that there was factually an issue with parents committing crimes and threatening school boards. Everyone in America knows if there was an actual threat at an actual school board, your local police, your local sheriff would deal with it, and they would handle it the way that they handle any other threat across the country. So the notion that the federal government had to spend its time and resources on this truly localized issue, if it was an issue, it's just completely divorced from reality. Completely divorced. But that wasn't, they didn't care. They went ahead and they just plowed ahead. They're like, hey, guess what? This is exactly, to your point, this was to achieve a political end, at least in their opinion, which, raises other questions about the use of federal resources to advance political ends, which I thought Democrats used to care about and not want to do. But you have the entire Biden administration activate itself to try to influence the outcome of a gubernatorial race in Virginia in 2021, and that blew up in their face. So look, it's and it was not only that, but it was also Cardona and the Department of Education. They had a role to play in all this stuff as well. So if you think the way that the education system was weaponized, and that the resources of the federal government were weaponized against parents who at the time were rightly speaking out about the stuff that they were seeing, and the stuff that they're continuing to see today, is crazy. And a lot of it was driven by this whole also happening in parallel to all of this gender ideology garbage that was just spreading like wildfire across the country. The notion that if your kid was confused, that your kid had some kind of underlying psychological issues, that it must be because they were born in the wrong body. And that the only solution then was that they had to identify as something else other than how they were born. And they were supported by, supposedly, it was supported by sound scientific studies, by organizations like WPATH, who had really documented all this stuff. And they advanced this ridiculous narrative. Remember the narrative? The narrative was, if you don't trans your child is going to die. Your child is going to commit suicide. So if you don't want a dead child, you have to allow them to chop off their genitalia. Which is the dumbest thing that you have ever heard, but so many people in the country fell for it. And recently, it seems like WPATH has had some problems.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, just this month, the FTC brought an enforcement action against WPATH for making these misleading claims and misleading parents, and really, junk science. So that's a real big deal from the FTC to get at the root of this problem. And, going back, I think it was 2 years, we had a FOIA that we sent to the FDA, which there was a doctor at the FDA, a career doctor, that said in an email that puberty blockers actually increased depression and suicidal ideation in children, but we should get these approved anyway for their use. So it's actually the opposite when you're talking about, the dangers of this stuff. It's not, the danger isn't not giving this to kids. The danger is actually giving this to kids beyond the common sense approach. Some of these things that they're prescribing off label actually result in depression and suicidal ideation.
Well, all right. So let's think about this from a legal perspective, right? Which is, a thing that we have to do, a little framework to provide for folks. What is the, historically speaking, if you're to take the founders and you're to transport them in time to today, and he said that the federal government, whether it's at the FDA, whether it's elsewhere, was in the business of getting involved with all of this stuff under the Biden administration, of advancing these things and going after school districts and saying that, in fact, you would have problems if you didn't conform your laws and practices, state or locality or private business, to allow people to use whatever bathroom that they want. What do you think the kind of the federal and state framework is, the nexus between police powers and some of the powers of the federal government to get involved here? Now, clearly I have views. I think the federal government has a role to protect fundamental rights of individual Americans, which would involve, contrary to what happened in the Biden administration, protecting the rights of women to have their own spaces and men to have their own spaces. If there's a more protected, inherent, inalienable right that a human being has, it's not to be raped. I mean, like in a bathroom. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the founders believed is that there were rights, separate from what the government could decide. And then there were rights, and those rights had to be protected by the government. I think what you're seeing amongst those who are kind of skeptical of the founders, skeptical of the Constitution. Remember, we had, what was the project name under the Biden administration that wanted to restart, the birth of this country, to recognize.
Oh, right. Yeah.
1619 project. The idea is to be totally against what the founders believed. And, it's not up to Americans to really decide what their rights are. It's up to Washington. And this is something the founders directly resisted. They didn't. They impugned the idea that you were going to have the elites of Britain decide the form of governance over Americans without giving them voting rights. And yet, that is precisely what those who are skeptical of the Constitution want today, which is, you don't have self-determination. You don't have federalism, which says that communities, school boards, parents have any self-determination. It's up to what Washington elites think is best. And of course, Washington elites know better than Americans. And, if we just put our trust in them, everything will be better. And how dare you interfere with what the elites think is best?
Well, it reminds me a little bit this hypothetical. I don't know if you've ever seen, like, Dana Carvey does the thing where he imitates Paul McCartney talking to John Lennon if he were talking to him about what's going on today. I mean, look, I think first of all, the founders would be like, what the hell is the Department of Education? And,
Right.
Why do we need that?
Yeah.
But I think what you'd see is you'd have, back then you had the Federalist Papers, right? And then you had the anti-Federalist Papers from the people that are like, well, no, this is going to lead to X, Y, and Z. I think they'd be like, see, this is what we were warning about. This is what we were warning about. And it's been a slow creep towards, greater federal enforcement. Now, people will turn around and say, oh, well, Republicans want to get rid of the Department of Education, but they're filing all these civil rights complaints on, transgender bathrooms and stuff. Well, that's not based on the Department of Education. That's based on the law and the Constitution, right?
It makes so much sense when you say it like that.
Or it's. And then I've had people that say, oh, Republicans, they're so patriotic, but they don't like their government. Like, that's the point. You like America and what America stands for and its principles. But when your government is going way beyond what those principles ever contemplated, except for the most pessimistic of the founders, that's a problem.
Yeah. And to bring it full circle, that's what these school boards were doing before the Garland Memo. These school boards were acting like mini governments, and they were saying, this is how we're going to run the school. This is what we're going to teach your kids, and you don't get to say anything about it. And parents were like, what the heck? These are our kids. We care about them. We want to be involved and know what they're being taught. And so they were angry, and they were speaking up at these school board meetings, and the school boards didn't like that, and they wanted to shut it down. And then here comes the Garland Memo.
Yeah, and they'll come back, and the left will say, oh, so you don't really want local control. You want federal control because you want the federal government to come in and intervene, or you want the federal. No, the Constitution takes primacy over all of that.
Right.
So these schools, it's not about federal control or they have to follow a federal rule. They have to follow the Constitution. And if they want money, right? If they want money from the federal government, then they need to follow the conditions set in Title IX or Title VI. Look, you don't have to take this money. We're happy not to give it to you, but if we're going to give it to you, you need to adhere to the terms of the contract.
Yep. No, I mean, that's exactly right. And, the other thing here, I think, is that when you have a federal government whose purpose, as we discussed with Andrew Ferguson, of course, what is the role of any government? What is the proper role of any government? Well, you got to provide for the common defense, the general welfare of the people. And when we say welfare, of course, we're not talking about cash welfare. We're not talking about government benefits. We're talking about welfare in the sense that the founders understood, which is quality of life and in individual liberty and maximizing that. Governments either exist to promote the general welfare, and they act accordingly to do it, or they act in such a manner that is so inconsistent with that notion that eventually they're going to lose the ability to do that because the people will revolt. And that can be, that doesn't always end up in the best situation. Most of the time it ends up going poorly because the people who seize upon that tend to have Marxist ideations and underpinnings with the way that they approach things. And so when you look at institutions or governments or groups like the federal government under Joe Biden, the notion that they are going to force this ridiculous gender ideology on all of these parents in schools across the country is just, I mean, it's not only contrary to the Constitution, contrary to federal law, especially with spending power, but it's also contrary to common sense in government if it cared about its own self-preservation, contrary to that too. So that's it for this segment. Stay tuned for the next. Well, guess what? It's that time of the day. It's that time of the week. It is time for us to cover this week's bad legal take.
From viral bad arguments to headline mistakes, we're calling them out on bad legal takes.
So this week, our bad legal take, the first bad legal take of the week, comes from our good friend and our dear colleague, Ian Pryor. What you got?
Well, this month, we had a federal district court in Idaho, a Biden judge. Of course, it's always the Biden judges, declared and enjoined a law passed by the Idaho legislature that said bathrooms are limited to sex, biological sex. So you could be arrested if you go and you use a women's room unless there's an emergency or there's simply nothing else available and then you have to use the bathroom, right? So there's very limited exception, which is still kind of crazy. The court found that the law was void for vagueness. So a law that prohibits men from using women's bathrooms is void for vagueness. And it granted class certification to every transgender or gender expansive individual in Idaho who can, I guess, now go and use any bathroom they want until this gets taken up on appeal.
That's insane. Is it because the court couldn't define what a woman is?
Well, actually it wasn't. It was because the court couldn't define what an emergency was. Like, I guess emergency is a vague term when you have to use the bathroom. I think we all know what it means. But I guess they found that emergency or not having another alternative was simply too vague for this common sense law that codifies 40,000 years of human history to be sufficient to stand.
I have so many questions. How do we have a Biden judge in Idaho?
It's a great question.
We have 2 Republican senators.
Grego, you should take a look at the Montana courts too.
I mean, like, how is that even possible? I mean, look, I'm a big proponent, on the one hand, of the Constitution giving the president the prerogative to nominate the individuals that he chooses, and then for the Senate to give advice and consent. And advice and consent, in my opinion, does not mean veto power. I think the blue slip is a horrible tradition, and I think it needs to be eliminated personally because it is antithetical to the Constitution and the senatorial norms. It protect all of the wrong things. That being said, how in the heck do we have a judge in Idaho, who's been confirmed in recent years, willing to issue such a decision? How does that happen?
That is a great question. And I think that's the importance of making sure that we have good judges that are willing to stay on the bench.
Well, it's also
as long as
just,
possible.
you look at the 45th administration when, President Trump's first administration, when he was nominating judges, you had, groups on the left that had these 30-page briefing documents on every nominee that went in, to their prior opinions, if they were state-level judges, that went into their backgrounds, their op-eds, anything that was public. And the senators would have these reports, I think it was Alliance for Justice, and use them to probe these nominees. Then all of a sudden, when Biden was in power and nominating judges, the Republicans, and the outside groups didn't have any of these reports. And so a lot of these judges just went through without any scrutiny. Sometimes the Republicans didn't even show up at the hearings, and, then we're surprised.
I mean, I just can't get past this. Idaho, the red state, the potato state, potato land, one of the most conservative areas. If you've ever been to Idaho, conservative areas, good people, great people of Idaho. How do we have a district court judge who is willing to do something like this in Idaho? I cannot fathom that. Just like the bench in Montana, just like the bench in so many places. Why do we tolerate this in red states?
Well, I think part of it is, and I don't know if Idaho does this, is these judicial commissions.
Right.
Right. And, we want to be bipartisan. And even in places like Florida, where you have, 2 Republican senators, there was a judicial commission during the Biden administration, and they used the State Bar Association to determine who would be on the commission. So we want a bipartisan selection commission. And, lots of judges, Biden was able to appoint judges, Obama was able to appoint judges in, Florida federal courts. Senators, were fine. They returned blue slips on these judges, and they used a commission. I think that's something where, again, right, the president, as you said, Gene, should have sole discretion as to who gets picked. These are not state judges. The senators ultimately have to make sure that the president, who he chooses, gets confirmed, particularly Republican senators. And when you use these commissions, you certainly dilute, the philosophical purity of federal judges.
Well, I mean, I think every person that's up for a judicial position should be asked the question that Ketanji Brown Jackson was asked, which is, can you define a woman?
Right.
Right? Can you define the difference between a man and a woman? Should men be allowed into women's spaces or play in women's sports? That needs to be a question for every single judge, because not only does it show their competence as a legal mind, but just as somebody with a brain, really.
Well, the point is you bring up this case, and, any good lawyer, and ideally any good judge, if you see a statute, and the problem is that the word sex is not void for vagueness. If that's not where you have the ambiguity, but it's on emergency, you strike it. You leave in the sex portion of the statute. And clearly, she refused to do what is most appropriate for a judge and just scrap the whole statute because of that one term, which is, again, right, that should be a filter. Where are the Republican senators in identifying that this is the kind of judge this judge would be?
Well, speaking of judges, speaking of ridiculous situations, we also have in the Northern District of Georgia, Judge Ross. I don't know, you've probably seen the headlines about this situation where apparently the highest and best use of her time, according to a complaint and a finding by the 11th Circuit about an ethical violation, was to spend her time having sexual relations with someone in her chambers loudly while her clerks were around, and then assigning her civil docket to clerks entirely to handle. And so the question becomes, again, Now, Georgia, sadly, right now has two very liberal senators, John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. And so the blue slip process isn't necessarily to blame, and Joe Biden was president. But how can someone with that type of credentials, or the lack of credentials and the lack of ability and the lack of discernment and discretion, how is it that someone like that can get confirmed into the Senate? This is a Biden confirmation. This is a judge that Joe Biden nominated and got confirmed. So for all the things that we hear the Democrats say and the liberals say about Trump and the fact Trump judges and Trump is radicalizing the judiciary and all this other stuff. I mean, my God, look at what these people are doing that Joe Biden put on our federal courts with a lifetime tenure.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things. One is I don't believe that a judge just all of a sudden falls into this bad behavior. There's signs and indicia before they became a judge, and why weren't those vetted? The other thing is, to your point, we have a constitutional condition on lifetime appointments, which is good behavior. This is bad behavior. This is bad behavior, and yet, what's Congress doing? You have the impeachment power. One of the reasons why throughout American history, the most common federal officer who's been impeached and removed has been federal judges is because it's a deeply American thing that if a federal judge, a lifetime appointee, behaves badly, that there is this idea that there's going to be accountability. It's not a forever job. High crimes and misdemeanors are justifications for you being removed. It shows that you don't have this ivory tower branch of government. There is accountability. And yet here, right, she's going to serve throughout many future presidential administrations.
I mean, just think about the things that we've seen over the last year and a half in terms of bad behavior, or other bad indicia of bad behavior, or other bad, really, really blatantly wrong or conflicted decisions come out of district courts across the country. So whether it's this judge, whether it's Judge McConnell, who this organization, America vs. Legal, had filed a complaint about last year, whether it's Judge Boasberg with ordering the planes to turn around with terrorists on them, whether it's any number of these things, I guess the question is, where is Congress?
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that you pointed out that extremely concerning is that she's assigned her entire civil docket to her clerks. Right. Like people need to understand clerks, they've oftentimes just graduated from law school.
Right.
I mean, so they're not unintelligent to get that job, but they have no experience as lawyers yet for the most part. And she's saying this this major portion of my work, I'm just going to let basically advanced law students decide. I mean, that is scary. And then you have to ask yourself, how many of these other judges are doing that? Who's actually making these decisions, right? Are these decisions coming from people who graduated law school a year ago? Or are they coming from a judge who should be the one that's making the final decision here, that has some intellectual capacity to analyze it and then direct the clerks that this is how I want to come out, but let me know if you find something differently. Not, here you go, you write it, I sign it.
Well, Ian, she was very busy.
Well, that's one way of putting it. I mean, look, I know that when I was a year or two out of law school, whatever my capabilities were, I would not have been situated to render judgments in complex civil litigation cases. I mean, I could have done it, I think, if I had enough, time and whatever. But there's just something to be said about the experience, in the discernment and the judgment that you learn over years of practicing, over years of spending time, and the notion that a federal judge, a district court judge, is handing anything over to her clerks without proper supervision and monitoring and direction is I mean, that's impeachable offense, I think, in a lot of cases. I mean, why not just give it to the janitors, the building janitors? I mean, what would you do then? Would that be impeachable for Congress? If you had, so here's the hypothetical. If you had the building janitor and the judge assigned the civil docket to the building janitor, would that be an impeachable offense? Yes or no? Okay, well, so maybe not the building janitor. Maybe it's this court, the marshals. Maybe you hand over the civil docket to the marshals. Would that be an impeachable offense? Well, I mean, then they go to the clerks. You just go down the line and you realize that this is an abdication of their duty. This is bad behavior in office. This is not what anyone should be doing. This is not what they're put in office for. We don't nominate people to be federal district court judges and the Senate confirm them for them to abdicate their duties and give their work to somebody else. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, this is a great point because, you think about the chief judge of the 11th Circuit. If he is aware that you have a judge who is abdicating her duties, there are lots of things you could do. Number one, you assign her docket to another judge, right? If the judge is not adjudicating these cases, assign it to another judge. The other thing is that any Article III judge in the entire country, I guarantee you some are not as busy as others. Idaho probably doesn't have the same docket as Atlanta. The chief judge could make a recommendation to the chief justice, I'd like this judge to sit by designation. There are remedies to ensuring, the parties before the courts get their day in court. And, is that happening? Clearly not.
We also have the Supreme Court just recently declined to take up this case involving Judge Newman. Do y'all track that? Who, I guess the allegations are, if you have been tracking the story, that her colleagues basically removed her. She's like 90 something years old, and her colleagues said she's incapable of adjudicating cases. Her side of the story is that she is capable of doing it. And here you have the Supreme Court decline to get involved in this particular case, which, I guess which leads to just the broader question. Institutionally, what needs to be done for the American people to have restored confidence in Article III, right? In the notion that you are going to have judges deciding cases and controversies between parties before a court, and that judges are held accountable, and that judges are not, living in an ivory tower, living by a different standard than what they would tolerate before practitioners in front of their own courtroom. Like, what needs to be done?
Yeah, I think, I think in both sides are to blame on this. We're essentially picking judges who could be tenured law school faculty. They haven't really represented, everyday Americans. If they've done legal practice, it's been representing corporations, typically not, individuals who really are in litigation for emotional reasons, who deal with the psychological factors of litigation. They haven't done that. And so they become immune to the kind of democratic aspects of being a judge, particularly being a trial judge. And I think conservatives certainly need to kind of change that. And we need to, show that judges are resolving everyday disputes. Their goal is to not write academic treatises. It's to resolve cases and controversies. And that requires some level of judgment, some level of experience that you're not going to just get in an ivory tower law firm. You have to get it by being in the real world, by being a former prosecutor, by being someone who's worked in the state courts, works in the federal courts, by someone who, has represented individuals.
One of the problems too is you're seeing a lack of, of this push and pull where district court judges actually care about getting reversed. It seems right now that there's a lot of district court judges that they don't care. They're going to get reversed, even in appellate circuits that wouldn't say are conservative. We've seen a lot of reversals, and it doesn't seem to be getting across to district court judges. There doesn't seem to be any disincentive to getting reversed all the time, which I think is not always been the case. I remember when I clerked on the state Supreme Court in Rhode Island, we had one guy that was always getting reversed, and he didn't care. But most of the judges, they did not like to get reversed, and they tailored their decisions as best they could, knowing that, look, this is my reputation here. I don't want to be the judge that's always getting told I was wrong. Don't see that much anymore.
So here's I guess here's my view. We're at a point where there's enough people on the bench who Joe Biden, Barack Obama, principally, have put on the bench, who have this kind of loser honey badger mentality where they just don't care. anymore, where they're just like, I'm just going to render whatever decision that I want. And they don't care if they get flipped on appeal, because what becomes politically reinforcing for them is that when they get flipped by the circuit courts or when they get flipped by the Supreme Court, it allows their political base to come back and say, oh, look at this out of control Supreme Court. Look at Trump's out of control Supreme Court. There's anti-democracy. This is anti-democratic institutions. This is why we need revolution. This is why we need to pack the court. So they have people now who just don't care because it's politically convenient. It becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. That is why I think they're going to continue down this road until somebody actually holds them accountable and impeaches one of these judges. And again, this is not lawfare. This is not warfare. This is nothing of the sort. This is doing what the founders intended when they set up Article 3. What's wrong with impeaching a judge who commits impeachable conduct?
To your point earlier, though, what do we have to see for that to happen, for Congress to act? I mean, we've seen some crazy stuff out of these courts and from these judges, insane behavior like we talked about, having sex. I mean, she's a judge. It's insane. So where's the line? What do we have to see?
It's political will. It's political will because, you know, I mean, I think to your point, how much worse does it have to get? And,
Right.
you know, it can get
Far
worse, a lot better, and still, you know, congressmen won't act. Yeah.
Look, I mean, it's if you're an institutionalist, if you're a committed institutionalist who cares about Article 3, you're a person who cares about reputation, it is in your vested interest to clean house, and to ensure that the other political branches conduct themselves in accordance with the way that the founders intended. Because then you get this healthy ecosystem where people are actually keeping each other in check. But right now, the only people keeping each other in check are the courts, continually frustrating the lawful exercises of the executive branch and also the judiciary. And there's no accountability coming back to that third branch. So that's probably a lot about crazy judges, or I should not say crazy judges, about the jurists in Article 3 and their willingness to issue decisions that comport with reality, the Constitution, and laws of the United States. Not ascribing blame or issues to any one particular judge today, but in general, we need accountability. All right, that does it for this week's episode. By the way, as you know, we're coming up on our 250th birthday as a country. I hope that you take some time with your friends and family this coming week to enjoy your time with them, to enjoy the freedom that you have as an American in this country, and that you take time to remember all of the Americans who've died, the Americans who signed their lives on the dotted line so that you can be where you are today. We'll see you next time.